Several years ago, I picked up a mystery novel by an author I had never read. The title was a little cheesy, but I was looking for something light and fun, and besides, I wanted to meet a new author. A few chapters into the book, and I was done. The main character was likable enough, but completely baffling. She took actions that made her look absurdly suspicious to the police, and she never seemed to question things that I thought were waving red flags. At one point, I suspected that she had been drugged by an acquaintance, but the character did not seem to suspect anything at all. I thought, this woman is not bright. To be fair, I didn't finish the book, so maybe she turned out to be an undercover genius at the end. I have had some time to reflect on why I just could not even with that novel, and I think the answer is convention. When we classify stories into types or genres, we do that according to convention, that is, something customary or expected in a type of story. For example, it is conventional for fantasy to incorporate magic or supernatural beings. There may or may not be specific things like elves or unicorns or schools of wizardry, but there must be something that does not exist in the natural world if the story is to be considered fantasy. Conventions are customary, so it is possible for an author to break them. But if they do, they should be aware that their place in a genre might be challenged. Some critics have challenged the idea that Star Wars is science fiction, arguing that it should be considered myth or fantasy since no scientific concepts are explored in the series and the Force seems more supernatural than natural. So, what are the conventions of detective fiction? The premise of a detective story is that a crime is committed and must be solved. The character who solves it may be an amateur or a professional detective, but that character is central to the genre. And I think this is where my own reading adventure went awry. I was convinced that the protagonist of the novel was not particularly intelligent. But the hero of a detective novel must be particularly intelligent. Indeed, it is an indispensable element of the genre that the detective must have the capacity to observe what others miss, make connections that would otherwise go unrecognized, and bring meaning to events that seem random to everyone else. In other words, the hero of a detective story must be able to make sense of things that are opaque to everyone else, and this requires superior intellect. From the beginnings of the genre, detective fiction introduced brilliant characters. The two earliest innovators of the genre were Edgar Allan Poe and Arthur Conan Doyle. Poe's detective is Auguste Dupin, who describes his method as ratiocination, which may be defined as a logical train of thought, such as might occur from spotting patterns or determining cause and effect. Doyle's detective, Sherlock Holmes, expands this idea through what he calls deductive reasoning, or drawing conclusions from specific pieces of evidence. Sherlock is actually using inductive reasoning, but that's another discussion. The point is that these two characters are introducing the idea that an unsolved crime is really an unsolved puzzle, and just like a puzzle, the answer can be arrived at through method and critical thinking. The thought processes of the detective can be as distinctive and original as the character. Most literary detectives come packaged with some advantage or experience beyond just intelligence that gives them insight into unusual cases. Sherlock Holmes conducts laboratory experiments that allow him to distinguish different types of tobacco ash or give a learned opinion of poisons. Like Einstein, he also seems to be able to think through difficult problems while playing the violin. Another classic detective is Lord Peter Wimsey, created by Dorothy Sayers and depicted here by Edward Petherbridge. As his title suggests, Wimsey is part of the British aristocracy, and his social connections and money give him access to people and places that the ordinary amateur would not be able to get at. Also, Wimsey is a veteran of World War I and worked in military intelligence. While these advantages make him a formidable detective, Sayers also uses them to develop Wimsey's human qualities. He suffers from PTSD that is triggered by solving crimes. That is, the responsibility of finding the guilty person and sending them to the gallows triggers Wimsey's war trauma. His determination to press on in the pursuit of justice despite personal cost makes him both human and heroic at the same time. Another innovation of Sayers comes through one of Wimsey's associates, Catherine Clemson. Miss Clemson runs a typing bureau, which is really a front for Wimsey's detective work. Unmarried women, the type who, in the early 20th century, worked in offices and hospitals and lived in boarding houses, were, according to Wimsey, the perfect aids to crime solving because they saw everything but went largely unnoticed by everyone else. Some critics have argued that Miss Clemson was the inspiration for one of Agatha Christie's most famous characters, who first appeared in print 3 years after. Miss Marple, an old maid whose experience of living in a small village where everyone knows everyone else's scandals makes her a shrewd judge of human nature. Far from being prim, Miss Marple has seen all the seedy side of human nature, and this makes her a far more accurate reader of emotions and motives than the official investigators. A late 20th century take on this conventional character is Jessica Fletcher, the protagonist of Murder, She Wrote. Angela Lansbury's character was imagined as an American version of Miss Marple, solving crimes in a small town in Maine, but also able to travel and encounter interesting situations because of her work as a professional writer. Of course, at some point, the author of detective fiction must account for where the police fit into all this. Many early detective stories work around the police as too incompetent to solve any but the most obvious and routine cases. This is probably a holdover of the Victorian era when police methods were genuinely lacking. The bungling of the Jack the Ripper case is a classic example of how politics and a lack of established procedures could make a crime unsolvable. However, the late Victorian era also brought a number of scientific innovations in criminology, including fingerprinting and the use of photography to document crime scenes. By the early 20th century, police methods had so improved, and so had police credibility, that it was possible to assign the police a different role in detective fiction. Lord Peter's good friend and collaborator is Police Inspector Charles Parker, who eventually becomes, in the novels, Chief Inspector Parker of Scotland Yard. Charles has official training, authority, and access, while Peter has social access and originality. This makes them well-matched colleagues. Agatha Christie's other great detective, besides Miss Marple, is Hercule Poirot, a retired Belgian police officer who works as a private investigator. He is skilled because he has police experience, and he is rather vain about his little gray cells, which is how he refers to his formidable intellect. In current pop culture, the detective is most likely to be a lawyer or official investigator. This may be because the science of criminology has become too sophisticated for the amateur. Think about the proliferation of the CSI series. These programs have emerged in an era when DNA testing and other scientific processes offer powerful tools for solving crimes, but only for those with high levels of expertise. Even if the amateur had the scientific mind of Sherlock, They would not have access to the kind of lab equipment or computer software necessary for modern crime scene analysis. One could also add that modern privacy laws make it hardly credible that someone could get hold of phone or medical records without going through official channels. If crime procedurals have changed to reflect scientific advances, legal dramas seem to have changed to reflect the social and political anxieties of the present. In the past, Perry Mason or Matlock could solve a crime by asking questions and finding evidence that the police overlooked. While that can still work in a legal drama, two recent television programs offer an interesting opportunity for cultural reflection. Elsbeth is a character originally created by producers Robert and Michelle King for their series The Good Wife, where she was a recurring character but not a regular. She also appears in the spin-off The Good Fight. In these series, Elsbeth is a lawyer who is called in to aid the regular characters when they find themselves in conflict with government agencies, usually intelligence agencies. Because there are legal protections that allow intelligence agencies to hide information in court for national security purposes, they are formidable legal opponents, and Elsbeth is called upon because she usually thinks of an offbeat or cunning way to get her client out of trouble. The character is quirky and funny, but also, as another character notes, devious. She embodies the use of intellect to counter raw power, creating a fair fight. The Kings have claimed in interviews that they brought her back to television because Elsbeth is a fun character who deserves her own show, and that is fair. But anyone who has seen their work should know that the Kings are always interested in the problem of government corruption. In the new series, Elsbeth is working on a consent decree, helping a New York City police district avoid civil rights violations. While the cops in the series are likable and honest, Elsbeth finds herself investigating corruption and the abuse of power in unexpected ways. The Kings use Elsbeth's quirky, upbeat personality to give the show an optimism that is lacking in some of their other work, but that does not mean that dark things are not present in the series. Elsbeth offers a view of the legal system that is always hopeful it can work well, and often it does work well. But there is always an underlying acknowledgement that rich and powerful people know how to leverage their influence to get away with appalling things. This theme also runs through the reboot of Matlock. At first appearing to be a corny remake of an Andy Griffith series from the 80s, the new Matlock surprised audiences with the revelation that Maddie is undercover at her white shoe law firm, looking for evidence that the firm's partners helped to hide evidence that would have exposed Big Pharma's role in the opioid crisis years sooner. This could have saved the lives of thousands, including Maddie's daughter. For Maddie, those who were supposed to uphold the law instead subverted it to protect a wealthy corporation. Maddie's investigation involves deception and manipulation, and the character makes choices that are occasionally unethical, even as she tries to remain on the right side of what is legal. Like Elsbeth, she is looking for justice in a world where the powerful and well-connected are frequently able to suppress it. Like the show Elsbeth, Matlock also reckons with the danger of deciding that the legal system has failed us. Maddie crosses ethical lines because what she is investigating is too personal. There is no way for her to be objective or impartial in a matter that involves the death of her own child. Her desired outcome is public exposure of wrongdoing. But it is clear by the end of season one that avenging her own family may involve destroying someone else's family in the process. I have mentioned these stories because, like the earlier fiction of Doyle, Sayers, and Christie, contemporary detective fiction thematically speaks to the same underlying need in society. The criminal justice system is like all other institutions, necessarily as flawed as the humans who make it work. We trust that the system has safeguards and checks and balances to offset the fallibility of human decision makers. But we also know that the safeguards are not always enough. Sometimes the truth is not found. The innocent may suffer needlessly, and the guilty may walk free. The danger is that we will either give up on justice as something unobtainable, or that we will decide that the criminal justice system cannot be trusted at all, and we will go outside the system in ways that are frightening for anyone who cares about peace and public safety. Detective fiction offers a safety valve for our frustrations. By imagining stories where the truth always comes out in the end, where the guilty are always caught and peace and order restored, detective fiction feeds our ideals of justice. It offers a moral universe in which it is possible to find the truth despite deception and all the red herrings, the false narratives that compete for our attention. We buy into this overarching narrative that crimes are solvable and the good guys can win, and this prepares us to act in good faith in the real world as citizens reporting to the police or testifying in court or serving on a jury. In fact, the criminal justice system often does work well, and when it does, it rewards our optimism and faith in each other. In the novel Thrones Dominations, Peter Wimsey tells his wife, detective stories keep alive a view of the world which ought to be true. Of course, people read them for fun, for diversion, as they do crossword puzzles. But underneath, they feed a hunger for justice, and heaven help us if ordinary people cease to feel that. For more conversations about literature and current issues, check out litandunlit.com. To read more about the history and conventions of detective fiction, check out the link in the show notes to a book chapter by Sarah J. Link.